Some Soviet criminal cases did more than reveal who was guilty. They exposed something larger and more unsettling: a justice system that could be shaped by ideology, pressured by politics, and weakened by its own need to look certain. If you want to understand Soviet crime, you also have to understand the cases where the system itself became part of the story. Welcome to Dark Files of the USSR. This is the channel where we uncover hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker realities behind the image of Soviet order. In the Soviet Union, law never operated in a neutral space. Criminal cases, political accusations, public trials, and even police warnings existed inside a system built on censorship, party control, and managed information. When a serious case emerged, the central question was not always just, "What happened?" Very often it was also, "What can this case be used for?" Or, "What must not be admitted?" That is why some Soviet cases revealed more than guilt or innocence. They revealed cracks in the structure of justice itself. One of the earliest and most important examples is the assassination of Sergei Kirov in 1934. In a narrow sense, the case looked simple. The gunman, Leonid Nikolaev, was caught immediately, but the larger truth was never fully settled. Britannica notes that Kirov's murder became the turning point that helped launch the Great Purge. And it also notes that many historians have believed Stalin was behind the assassination, because Kirov was popular enough to be seen as a rival. That means the case stopped being just a murder investigation almost at once. It became part of a political transformation. That is where the first major crack appears. A justice system is supposed to narrow uncertainty. The Kirov case widened it. Later accounts raised serious doubts about the handling of security around Kirov and about how easily Nikolaev was able to act. But instead of producing a transparent search for responsibility, the murder was used to justify mass repression. Britannica's summary of the Great Purge says the famous trials of the late 1930s presented confessions obtained through torture or fabricated by the secret police. In other words, a major political killing helped open the door to a system in which confession could replace proof and political usefulness could replace justice. The Leningrad affair revealed a similar weakness from another angle. Britannica states that the purge of officials connected to Zhdanov's circle was based on charges of treason and conspiracy that were later shown to be fabricated. The same source says all the evidence presented in court came from preliminary examinations and confessions. That matters because it shows how fragile Soviet legal procedure could become when politics drove the case. Once the leadership wanted a certain outcome, the case could be built backward from the verdict rather than forward from the facts. That pattern became even clearer in the doctor's plot. Britannica describes it as an alleged conspiracy by prominent Soviet doctors to murder leading government and party officials. But after Stalin's death, the charges were dropped, and the case was widely understood to have been fabricated. This is one of the clearest examples of a legal structure being turned into political theater. A supposed criminal conspiracy was presented to the public as reality. Then, when the political environment changed, that reality collapsed. The legal system did not correct itself through open evidence and fair process. Power simply reversed its own earlier version of events. What these early cases show is that the Soviet justice system was vulnerable not only to error, but to construction. A case could be created, expanded, and enforced because the state needed it, not because the evidence demanded it. That is one kind of crack, justice distorted from above. But there was another kind as well. Not fabrication, but investigative weakness. And one of the clearest examples is Andrei Chikatilo. Britannica notes that Chikatilo murdered at least 50 people between 1978 and 1990, and that the case was significant not only because of the number of victims, but because police efforts to warn the public were hampered by official ideology, which held that serial murder was impossible in a communist society. That is already a serious institutional failure. If the system says a certain kind of crime should not exist, then it becomes harder to investigate that crime honestly and to warn the public clearly when it does. The case also exposed failures in forensic and investigative procedure. Britannica says that in 1984, Chikatilo was detained after suspicious behavior at a train station, and police found a knife and other suspicious items in his briefcase. Yet his blood type was misidentified against the forensic evidence, and he was not properly tied to the murders. Instead, he was convicted on a theft-related charge and released after a short time. He then continued killing. This was not just bad luck. It was a system-level failure in which ideology, poor evidence handling, and premature confidence combined to protect the wrong person. And that was not the only miscarriage surrounding the Chikatilo investigation. Amnesty International later cited the case of Alexander Kravchenko, saying that Soviet authorities had executed the wrong man for one of the killings in their desire to stop the murders quickly. That detail matters because it reveals another crack in Soviet justice. Pressure to close a terrifying case could lead not only to delay, but to irreversible injustice. A system under strain did not simply fail to identify the true offender quickly enough. It also punished someone else while the real offender remained free. What makes the Chikatilo case so revealing is that it sits between the older Soviet pattern of political distortion and the later Soviet pattern of institutional weakness. No one needed to fabricate an entire conspiracy, as in the doctor's plot, for justice to fail. It was enough for ideology to delay recognition, for investigative mistakes to go uncorrected, and for officials to want closure faster than truth. That is why this case belongs in any discussion of the cracks in Soviet justice. It exposed a system that could be dangerous not only when it was openly repressive, but also when it was simply too rigid, too defensive, and too eager to look effective. There is also an intellectual side to this story. A Berkeley study of Soviet criminology notes that Soviet scholars in the early 1960s still described crime as a phenomenon associated with capitalism and expected that the ugliest forms of social breakdown would diminish as socialism matured. That belief was not just academic. It shaped the atmosphere in which law enforcement worked. If crime was ideologically inconvenient, then admitting its real scale or real forms became harder. That helps explain both the reluctance to openly confront serial murder and the broader Soviet habit of fitting criminal narratives into political needs rather than allowing facts to lead where they might. Only in the late 1980s did glasnost begin to change that climate. Britannica defines glasnost as a policy of open discussion of political and social issues under Mikhail Gorbachev and says it began the democratization of the Soviet Union. That matters because many earlier failures of Soviet justice became visible only when the information system loosened. Glasnost did not undo the damage done by fabricated cases, coerced confessions, or investigative failures, but it made it harder to pretend those failures had never existed. Taken together, these cases reveal several different cracks in Soviet justice. The Kirov case showed how a murder could be converted into a tool of state terror. The Leningrad affair showed how fabricated charges and confessions could destroy officials through a formal legal process. The doctor's plot showed how the state could build an entire criminal case around political paranoia and then quietly abandon it. And Chikatilo's case showed how ideology, investigative error, and pressure for quick results could allow a real killer to stay free while innocent people paid the price. That is the deeper meaning of this topic. These cases were not important only because they were dramatic. They mattered because they revealed what happens when law serves power too closely for too long. A justice system can survive ordinary mistakes. What it struggles to survive is political distortion, ideological blindness, and institutional fear of embarrassment. In the Soviet Union, those pressures were often built into the system itself, and when that happened, truth became harder to reach. Not only for defendants, but for victims, families, and the public as well. In the end, the cases that revealed the cracks in Soviet justice were important because they showed that the real danger was sometimes larger than the original crime. The danger was a system that could force confessions, fabricate charges, punish the wrong person, delay warning, and still claim legitimacy. That is why these cases still matter today. They are not only stories about who was accused or convicted, they are stories about what happens when justice is no longer strong enough to stand apart from power. This is Dark Files of the USSR. If you want more fact-based stories about hidden crimes, buried fear, and the darker side of Soviet history, subscribe and stay with us.